Hey, welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Spencer, New York, a little town kind of in the middle of nowhere, but I'm loving it. It's beautiful here. It's been a real interesting shift to come to a place with overabundance of water versus Los Angeles. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thank you to all of you who support this podcast in various big and small ways, all of which are vitally important to making it possible. Big could be supporting with your money. We've gotten some great donations lately. I mean, just not like huge donations, but just really thoughtful that somebody is doing that. You can donate if you'd like at beyondorganicwine.com. And then small ways like people just making referrals and telling other people. And if you do that, I really appreciate it. Leave a great review. That helps a lot. It's an honor and a joy to be part of this movement to redesign wine around ecological knowledge. And I'd love to engage more with you. Please consider, if you haven't already, joining our Patreon subscription. As little as $5 a month helps immensely to contribute to build this resource for you. Not to mention, I hope to offer some really special deals to Patreon subscribers in the next year. More on that to come. Also, please join our email list if you haven't. BeyondOrganicWine.com is where you can do that, and I will never sell your info or spam you with unrelated emails, of course. Now, something's been on my mind for, it may be a year. I don't remember exactly when this paper came out. A scientific paper came out a little while ago, maybe as much as a year ago, and it created a lot of press because it was about a study that the French did in Bordeaux, somewhere in Bordeaux, where they studied the drought tolerance of 30 different varieties of grapes. Of those 30 different varieties, some were hybrids, and that's what caught my attention because the hybrids performed poorly, and this was noted in the press as well, and it was even cited as a reason why the EU might now start to be people, or some growers in the EU might be very hesitant to start adopting hybrid grapes in their wine growing. So that, of course, triggered me a little bit, I got a little chip on my shoulder about hybrids, especially when the French are talking about them and doing studies about them. And so I read this study, and that's when I started realizing I need to start reading studies that create press like this much more often, because also some things that weren't said is that, and it was really said that the hybrids perform poorly, and of course the traditional varieties that are super popular with the French, Cabernet and Pinot Noir, all did really well, of course. And it was almost like the more popular they were, the more drought tolerant they performed. Like even like the least popular varieties of French grapes were less drought tolerant. And I'm not saying that there was any shenanigans in the study to like support, the status quo, but it's just, it's just funny. But what legitimate issues I do have are that the top performing grape was actually a hybrid. It was just an interspecific hybrid of two non-vinifera species of grapes, because it was rootstock SO4. That was the one that performed the best in terms of drought tolerance. And the third best one was rootstock 110R, also an interspecific hybrid. But of course it's not considered a hybrid because it's not two species that include vinifera and something else, or three species that include vinifera. So that, I thought, showed a little bit of something. But also, the methodology showed something. The methodology, the way that they did the study was they grew cuttings, own-rooted cuttings, in 7-liter buckets in a greenhouse. So this, first of all, was not at all like normal growing conditions in a vineyard out in the world. But also, Cabernet never gets grown out in the real world on anything besides rootstock. Like, it never gets own-rooted. And so, can we even trust the results of this? I mean, Pinot Noir doesn't either. None of these vinifera get grown without rootstock. And now, maybe they do incredibly well because, like, they did well on their own roots and then put them on something like SO4, which, quote unquote, won this competition, did perform best in this study. And maybe do well, but maybe not, because maybe something would be lost in translation there. We don't know. Like, the study doesn't tell us. Like, we can't determine anything about Cabernet's real world drought tolerance because it wasn't studied. So, and then, okay, final thing is there were only 4 hybrids out of these 30 grapes that were studied, and plus the 3 rootstock that were included, which are hybrids. So 7 total, 3 of which performed really well, the rootstock, because they didn't include vinifera. Weird, isn't it? But also, the 4 that performed, and they did perform badly. They performed at the bottom 4, like out of 30, they were, 26 to 30 in performance in their drought tolerance. But they were all the French developed hybrids that are approved in the EU. So they all have a certain specific level of vinifera, and they all, were developed for that specific site. And they only represent themselves. They don't represent the pantheon of hybrids. Like, there are a lot of hybrids out there, but actually it's bigger than that, because hybrids aren't just a few varieties that we have now. Like, hybrids are an ongoing, living, developing idea. It is wine adapting in real time. It is not something that like we can develop way more drought tolerant hybrids than we have in Cabernet and Pinot Noir. Like, that's something we can do because hybrids aren't stagnant things. We can just develop. We can take like SO4 and use its drought tolerance and develop in different flavors and things that we want to make it a delicious grape. Like, hybrids aren't this object. They are a verb. They are us embracing a process of adaptation in our wine versus clinging to 4 grapes. I'll just say the 4, Cabernet, Pinot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, there's a few more than that, like maybe a couple handfuls of top performing grapes that somebody decided are like the highest and best that wine can ever be and will ever be. And so we must preserve them at all costs, versus the idea that wine is a living thing. It's a living culture that will develop, and we can develop ecologically to adapt to whatever the future brings us, whether it's drought or flood. So anyway, that's I just want to say, like, just because if you are making your decision about whether to incorporate hybrids into the future of wine based on this study, you're an idiot. That's all I have to say. Now, yeah, and so take another look and rethink your life. Okay, that's been on my mind. That's just been bothering me for a while. Changing the subject, here's a quote. "We are members of natural communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves. Only by nurturing them can we nurture ourselves. Palates link cultures with landscapes, and moderating the impact of palates on human and environmental health will require changes in the kinds of foods we produce and consume." End quote. That's Fred Provenza from his article titled "Is Grass-Fed Meat and Dairy Better for Human and Environmental Health?", which I'll link in the show notes. And I love that statement that palates link cultures with landscapes. I think that's really cool. In this episode, I speak with contract grazer Christian Cain about the work that he does with his company Perennial Grazing in Northern California. You'll discover, as I did, that Christian is a very thoughtful person who was inspired by Masanobu Fukuoka and Alan Savory, among others. So we discuss not only the practical considerations that will be very valuable to everyone who is planning or considering working with contract grazer, but also we dig into how regeneration of a landscape with well-managed animals actually works. So this is packed with juicy insights and important information for anyone who wants to integrate grazing animals in their vineyard or orchard, or just anybody who is fascinated by soil health, regenerative viticulture, and how that actually translates into more delicious wine. In fact, Christian at one point mentions a scientific article by Reed Griggs, among other authors, but he mentioned Reed Griggs, and I will link that in the show notes. The first line of the conclusion of that article is, quote, "The microbial ecosystems within vineyards exert critical influences on grapevine health and wine quality," end quote. Now, of course, it's about a lot of that, but that was kind of the gist that we were talking about in the episode. At the end of this episode, I asked Christian about a class that he teaches on slaughtering. And This opened up a really profound discussion, and I really hope you stay tuned till that point at the end because Christian brings in some really, really valuable insights about food sovereignty and how our ability to shepherd this process of transforming landscapes into nutrition for us and sustenance for us is the one thing that has been again and again throughout history taken away from humans in an effort to control them. And so many of these skills that might seem unsavory to us, that might seem a something that makes us squeamish, like slaughtering animals and breaking them down into food, processing them into food that we can eat, is actually this really important food sovereignty skill and power. And even if you don't eat animals, I think you can make correlation to any kind of farming like that. And I think it's really important to think about this entire interview within that context and how it's so much bigger than wine, what we're doing with these landscapes, what Christian is doing with his company. So enjoy. Christian, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Could you introduce yourself and your company, where you are in the world as well, or where you're based, I should say?
Yeah. Yeah. So my name is Christian Cain, and my business is called Perennial Grazing, which I started at the end of 2016. And I am currently in, like I say, the home base on paper, which is Cape Valley in Yolo County, Northern California. But the business spends actually most of the year, the past couple of years, in Sonoma County and kind of across the North Bay, greater Northern California, Sonoma County, Napa County, Solano, a little bit of Amador, Sacramento County, Sonoma County. I think I said that one. Mendocino and Marin. So yeah, ranging all over, and that is providing ecological services and regenerative grazing services with small ruminants, namely sheep and goats, and as well as doing some talking, education, consulting, but yeah, mostly just providing the ecological services through the grazing.
Yeah. How long have you been doing this?
Well, that in 2016 was when I got my own flock,
Okay.
but the first time I started doing grazing work and land work was um, in 2009. I started working at the first ranch that I worked at was in 2009. So that was kind of an introduction to the whole thing, and that was in the Eastern Sierras next to the bristlecone pines outside of Bishop, California.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, there's a ranch connected to a college that I was going to out there in the high desert up at 5,000 feet. And yeah, so that was a first exposure to a lot of the stuff. And I remember first exposure to working with sheep there. But
Were you going to that college, to study animal husbandry and
no, it was
management?
actually a liberal arts college. It's a really kind of like unconventional program called Deep Springs College,
Okay.
and it's just a 2-year program that's like technically it's a junior college, although pretty much none of the students, I think technically you can get an AS
Okay.
or whatever it is. So basically you can get an associate's from there, but very few people do. Pretty much you just go there for the first 2 years and get credits, and then apply as a transfer to a 4 year. That's kind of the main thing people do, and what I did. And then you apply those credits. You get to use those credits, hopefully all of them, when you get to your 4 year. And there's no tuition, no room and board. There's a lot of one of the pillars of it is student self-governance, and there's only about 25 to 30 students at the college at a time.
That is really interesting. That sounds like a California college. Um,
Yeah, 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 it's interesting. It's like an hour from the nearest town, up there at
oh, wow.
5,000, up there at 5,000 feet in the high desert. And yeah, so there's a ranch and farm and hay production farm
And
connected to the college.
so you did go, and then you went on to a 4 year. Was the 4 year still liberal arts?
Yeah, it was actually. Yeah, it was called Middlebury College in Vermont.
Oh yeah, I know Middlebury. Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
know that because of I worked with people who went there in Vermont. I mean, I worked in Vermont Harvest and worked with
Oh, cool.
Deirdre Heek and Caleb from La Garagista, and they both went there. Yeah, got to see that. Got to drive through the campus too at one point.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah. So, uh, what? I mean, totally random, but what did you study?
I got a degree in poli sci.
Poli sci. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Um,
and then, and there was a farm there, and I was, it's kind of like, very much got bitten by like a bug, or tapped into something maybe epigenetic at that first ranch in the Eastern Sierras, and then was doing
sure.
that in Texas, North Carolina, Vermont, Washington State, all over, as well as
You kind
uh,
of you moved around working at different ranches.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then also did a bunch of kind of stints cooking, like line cook, and then also did a lot of work with like homeless people, working with unhoused people, mostly like homeless youth in Vermont, and then again in Washington State, and kind of progressive politics work in the Bay Area a little bit. So
Christian,
yeah,
you
kind of
you sound like a pretty interesting guy.
a lot of this and that.
um,
Yeah,
it's
and
not.
then I landed here in Cape in 2016, and had like I was leaving Washington State and knew I wanted to get back into farming full time after doing the social work full time there, and
Mm,
was looking at Sonoma County and Marin County, and then also I kind of had on my radar a little bit that there was this Cape Valley that had like a really high density of small organic farms, and so I did a bunch of this was like at the end of 20, or like, yeah, kind of fall. There might be a little bit of dog noise in the background.
that's all right. No, I can't really hear too much. That's
Oh,
fine.
okay.
Yeah, no,
Um,
you. It's doing a good job of blocking out the background.
Gotcha. Yeah, so at the end of 2015, I toured a bunch of farms in Sonoma and Marin counties and here in Yolo. And then I didn't really have too
Was
much
that
of a
like
thought.
market research, or were you looking for a place to work more
I was
than?
doing job interviews, but also, just
Yeah.
kind of touring some places. There was a couple places that weren't listing positions, but I just said, hey, can I come by and take a look? And, also maybe if you're hiring later, you'll have, we'll have met each other.
Huh.
Um, yeah, and I met there was a lot of really cool folks. I think one thing, one big reflection from that, is that a bunch of I think all those farms I asked, like, what would it be like for a young person to start their own operation out here? And a lot of the Marin Sonoma folks were kind of scratching their head, and they were like, wow, that would be really, really tough. And
Just for
whereas,
the price of real estate, that kind of thing.
yeah, that's the main factor for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sadie, go in the back. Thank you. Um, yeah, but whereas here in Yolo, people say, oh yeah, there's this field and there's that field, abandoned almond orchard, abandoned walnut orchard. So there's that. And then um when there was also everybody kind of has their own story and different situation in terms of how they make their farm work, but um I was also interested to be learning somewhere where like the revenue of the farm products were what were supporting the whole thing.
Right.
And, I mean, it's just farming, and as a rule, organic farms are not profitable, so it's not like shade on anybody at all. But, I
Right.
met some
Right.
really great farmers, but it was like, oh, well, like this breaks even, and then my husband's a lawyer, or my
Right.
wife's a
Yeah.
lawyer, or different stories. And yeah, I was intrigued to learn somewhere where they were really, needed to make the numbers work. So yeah, that also kind
Uh,
of steered me out here to Cape, to YOLO.
so YOLO is where is that? It's the Sierras, right?
No, no, it's like Winters is in YOLO, Davis is in YOLO, which is like the
Oh,
main.
that's right. That's right. I think it's
Yeah,
fun
yeah,
there. How mu- is
yeah.
that
So it's
is
kind of like sometimes if I meet like tourists, I'll be like, okay, like halfway between Napa and Sacramento.
gotcha. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, or sometimes people in Napa, I'll say like, okay, it's on the other side of Berryessa.
I love that there's a county called YOLO in California.
Uh-huh.
Um, probably didn't matter when it was named, and now it's a thing. Now it's an
Right.
acronym. Um, well, cool. So when did you? I mean, so you're kind of you learned on the job, or you kind of learned by just doing, right? Like this wasn't a formal study situation. It was like hands-on apprenticeship situation, mentoring and learning by doing.
Yeah, working for people like
Like you didn't start
um
going to veterinarian school and stuff like that and
no,
steer.
definitely nothing formal in that way. Although the
Yeah.
first couple of years of getting into it, I was kind of I was I was, most days reading academic papers and was really trying to give myself like a good grounding in it. And still do, a couple times a week read academic papers about all this stuff.
Yeah. What are you
Um
reading? What are you reading these days? What have you read recently?
when those papers,
Yeah.
some of it was about animal husbandry stuff, like studies on heritability of different traits. Like, it's a big thing in sheep of like how often do the mom sheep reject a lamb when they have twins?
Mm-hmm.
And anecdotally, if you go and buy sheep from somebody, they'll say like, "Oh, like, oh, her mom was a good mom, so they're all going to be good moms." But I forget what it I forget. I want to say Illinois. I forget what university, but basically they did a study to actually find out what was heritable.
Uh-huh.
And so I was reading about that, and just it turns out that a lot of the behavioral things are just a lot less heritable than the physical traits.
So it's kind of like sheep have their own personalities, and just like humans, like we kind of are born with. There's the nurture, and there's nature, and and then there's just like what you have. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think to me, like the moral of the story is just that there's a lot of, people do a lot of sales and there's maybe a lot of wishful
Ah,
thinking when people are selling you their livestock and stuff.
right, right. So you just yeah, got
It's
it.
good to
Don't
get the science on it. Yeah, so I
yeah.
was reading on that and then reading also recently about, I think it was a study at Marin Headlands they had done of like native grasses pulling atmospheric carbon down into the soil at different depth profiles.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, so yeah, so I'm kind of constantly reading about that stuff, and then also on the drier end of things, kind of like trying to learn about bookkeeping for livestock-based businesses, like how you want to look at appreciation and depreciation of breeding animals as they grow into and maybe past their prime.
Oh wow, interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. So it's like a property. It's like an asset accounting.
Yeah, yeah. Basically, how you want to do the bookkeeping on it, and there's even like a lot of the big cattle guys will buy what they call puts. So it's like a it's not a short, but it's like you're basically buying a guaranteed position, so that like if the market crashes, you have a guaranteed option to sell your cattle at a certain market position.
Oh wow, that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah. What is it
Like
called? I
you're,
think it's called Ranching Returns. That's a really great. That's a good podcast for that kind of stuff
huh? Okay, good to
about
know.
the agribusiness of it.
That is really fascinating. Who knew?
Yeah.
um, so when did you get into Masanobu Fukuoka, and how does that apply to your grazing? And Alan Savory, although that seems a little more straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was all about the same at the beginning of 2016 when I moved to Cape Bay and had was working for a few people who were good mentors with sheep. And
Okay.
then I'll kind of like weave in the other question too of I got to work for people who were really good mentors and good farmers like Ken and Susan
Yeah.
at Pasture 42 and Sally Fox, who's a big yeah, it's had a very like fascinating like international career and then helped start the fiber shed there in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Um, but anyways, yeah, just good mentors. And then I, just kind of realized soon, okay, like nobody wants to have this kid, me at the time, be the one who's pulling the lamb when the lamb is stuck on the mom's pelvis, like when the mom's having trouble delivering the baby.
Right.
Nobody wants to let the kid do that. Nobody like driving the tractor. Just I realized there was all these kind of all the big learning moments, justifiedly nobody wanted me to do with their animals, so I was going to have my own animals um if I wanted to have those learning moments. And then that kind of dovetailed with yeah, reading Fukuoka and especially about his travels to California
Okay.
and yeah, seeing all of the especially in the abandoned nut orchards out here, just kind of seeing how people thought about grasses and looked at grasses, and yeah, just kind of wondering basically if there's a bit of a better way to do things. And a big question of it was, could I use these, could I use the sheep and the animal impact to allow these deep rooted native perennial grasses to outcompete the shallow rooted annual grasses, which when there's overgrazing, like on, almost all ranches, the annual grasses went out, and when there's undergrazing, like when you just rope off a piece of national forest or something and not don't let any impact come in, then the annuals also went out in that circumstance. So like no, over disruption, over impact, or under impact, no disruption. In both cases, the annuals went out, but it's, so it's like it's a very nuanced thing, and you're kind of working with a lot of the evolutionary biorhythms of these grasses to allow them to outcompete, allowing those native perennial grasses to outcompete the annuals.
Why that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, the overgrazing sort of makes sense, but why the undergrazing would the annuals still win out?
Well, one kind of meta answer to it might be, that these grasses and herbivores co-evolved.
Right,
So they evolved to interact with each other. And
right,
so, that plant is kind of happiest and again, working in kind of a biorhythm and expects, and on an evolutionarily gained intelligence level, it expects to be grazed. And that was another paper, that was a little while ago, but that was another paper I read is there was a university in China that did like I think they were perennial grasses. They did two strips. I think it was ryegrass. I can't, it was definitely, I think it was ryegrass. They did two strips of mowing, but to one alongside the mowing on one of the strips, they applied from a backpack spray or sheep saliva,
okay,
and to kind of have a experiment with a control plot.
okay,
And the plot that had the sheep saliva applied, there was a lot of enzymatic interaction and reactions on the with the tips of that grass and the sheep saliva, and basically that got communicated through the grass plant, so that that grass plant did a lot more tillering, budding, and basically like came back with a lot more, um, basically was just a lot more vigorous and grew a lot stronger than the ones without the treatment.
that's really interesting. Yeah, I've heard about that. I mean, I hadn't heard that specific study, but I'd heard about the saliva of the ruminants having an impact. Um, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
So
so a lot of
yeah,
it could be, like out here, it's kind of right now, like early May, and this is a pretty normal year. It's kind of a wet winter, but it's like if you graze if because when you walk around, like 98% of California's grasslands are non-native by volume, like all the oats and the bromes, especially the
right.
oats that the Spanish brought on purpose, but then a lot of other stuff got brought accidentally. But it's like 98% non-native by volume. So it's kind of rare that you see, or it's not rare, but you see a lot less of these native grasses. But this is a good time of year to be doing the work. And that right now, if you come through and do like an intensive grazing and graze it all down, then the those big majority of the grasses that have a very shallow root system, they don't really have any way to return at all. Basically, they've done their thing. They've set seed for the year and they're done. So most of them are
Right.
dormant, not dead anyways. But the perennial grasses can still tap into root moisture at deeper, tap into soil moisture at deeper profiles, basically deeper depth of the soil, and they'll also literally like cut off, slough off, and liquidate part of their roots to feed the soil biology and kind of reconvert it into uh, basically think like complex carbs down to simple sugars, and they'll
Right.
use that to generate new growth on top of the soil. But if and so that new growth happens on depending on the plant, say like the third to fifth day after you take that first bite out. But this is where the overgrazing comes in, because if you eat that new growth too, then that perennial plant doesn't have any more rootstock to liquidate, and so you go a long way towards just killing it.
So like you got to move the animals off that within 3 days, basically.
Yeah, so that's why when you get into grazing world, you kind of hear all these terms like mob grazing,
Right.
um, rotational grazing. That's why this stuff kind of gets to be so important.
Right. Movement is important. Keeping them on, moving on to new stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and that's also, I mean, it's kind of like everything comes together too, because once you're moving the animals to respect what the grasses need, then you're also moving the sheep away from their own old manure, which contains the parasites. And
right.
so and so like they're happier, and basically it's kind of, yeah, everything is all that, like I say, because of that coevolution, whenever you're making a good decision for one part of this relationship, you're usually making a good decision for every part of the relationship, the land and the sheep and everything and the grasses.
Right. So have you looked at this in other than dry land grazing? Like, does the same principles apply like east of the Mississippi, for example, here in the U.S.?
They apply very differently and they apply a lot less dramatically, I'd say.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, in
That was
that,
my thinking.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah,
There's just a lot. There's a lot. Like the whole world is a ruminant on the East Coast in a
uh-huh,
way. Like you
right.
don't need the rumen as much because you have a lot of decomposition happening and fermentation happening outside of animals because of
Right,
the
right. Yeah, I
moisture.
think yeah, on the East Coast it's a lot about keeping a certain level of palatability, keeping a certain level of biodiversity. Like I was in North Carolina a few years ago and looking at a field with a cow farmer and he was saying he has to mow it every 2 weeks or else wild persimmon trees just take over the field. Um,
That's great. I just planted
and I
some.
was like, oh well, that just makes me think of like feeding 1,000 goats, but
Yeah.
he had tried that and he just kind of got swallowed up by parasites. So
Oh, with the
um
goats, you mean?
yeah, yeah, parasites on the goats. So nothing's ever too easy, but yeah,
Yeah.
anyways, it's things apply very differently and there's kind of different goals and different application in a more humid environment. In like grazing world, especially like Allen Savory, people talk about brittle and non-brittle environments. It's kind of a shorthand for that stuff. So like
Right.
here in like Northern California or just California Mediterranean climate, we're a good example of the brittle.
Right. So, I mean, but Fukuoka, did he talk specifically about grasses and stuff like that and grazing, or was it just more of a perspective that you embraced or sort of got inspired by?
He didn't talk too much about grazing. I know that yeah, saw some of the differences of it when he came here to California. Um, I'm trying to remember let me see if I can pull this up.
Yeah, I mean,
His main
I probably should have prepped you for this. I was just fascinated to see that and see his name is one of
No,
the
I just remember the
inspirations.
name because he's actually done some consulting in the wine world. Uh, his main oh yeah, Larry Korn was his main
Oh yeah,
U.S. kind of acolyte or
right,
apostle, and so
right,
Larry
right,
Korn wrote a book called One Straw Revolutionary, and a big portion of that book is him touring Fukuoka around through California. I don't
right.
know if that would have been the 70s or the 80s. I think 80s. I'm not sure, but he yeah talks about a lot of things and recognizes some of the differences between the grazing practices. And there's one part where he talks to a collection of farmers about how much they all hate the thistle plant, and
Right.
he kind of reframes it as, okay, this is the beginning of a progression of kind of a ladder of life, making use of the soil and protecting the soil. And so it's just showing you that it's showing you that it's disturbed soil that's kind of hurting soil, and you just need to start there and keep building. And yeah, there's a bunch of other fascinating stuff in that book, but that's I think that part of it is very integral to my kind of grazing perspective, and there's a lot of overlap there with the savory stuff. But yeah, that's been a big part of my grazing perspective, and that's been a bunch of the ecological contracts I've got to do are helping landowners to like hugely decrease or remove the presence of noxious plants like yellow star thistle on their
Right.
land. And a lot of times, in the previous years they had just been creating more and more bare soil to deal with it, so like mowing the land, string trimming, tilling it in, and of course all that does is create the best possible conditions for an opportunistic plant like yellow star thistle. um, and so it's tough sometimes to talk to people about it because it kind of takes a longer term view and a less like direct control oriented approach. But to me the best thing to do for that is to bring along the health of that land, that grasslands, and then you just bring up the health of the grasses so that they outcompete the that they shade out the yellow star thistle. And more importantly, if you can kind of create a mulch layer with those grasses, then then they'll actually shade out the seeds and create a whole different pasture composition based on which kind of seeds can penetrate through that mulch layer.
Hmm. Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of just always about like that's yeah, a lot of what I loved about Fukuoka was always moving up that ladder and progression of biology and of life, rather even though that involves, kind of interspecies collaboration and involves patience rather than always, defaulting to the method of direct immediate
Direct.
control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is your perspective? How do you see grasses? How do you see rangeland? How do you, like now that you've been at this a while. I
Yeah,
mean,
well now it's like it's all gone to my head. So now I see dollar signs. Now it's, those are kind of the salad days back, back in 2016, and now it's like now it's a business.
Yeah. Is that been a difficult transition for you psychologically? Or is it like, I mean, is it because you're under stress to support yourself and survive, and that's what you're talking about, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, no,
Yeah.
really, it's all good. Like, it's kind of like this was in 2016. That was the dream. That was the dream job, was to support myself doing ecological regenerative shepherding. And so the dream came true. And so
Yeah.
no, I mean, really, I'm grateful for it. But just it's kind of like anything. Like being somebody who makes a good sandwich versus somebody who opens a sandwich shop.
Right.
It's you get caught up in just making sure all the numbers work, making sure all the logistics add up. But no, I'm glad that I'm still excited by the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah. Is there, I mean, I know that you have, or at least on your website, you talk about a goal of restoration as sort of what you're trying to do. And, you've just talked about that, sort of bringing the health back to a piece of land through grazing. Has that, I mean, have you seen that happen? Like, is, is the reality that, I mean, is it a better way, do you think, what you're doing than what, you know, I know this is kind of like a, it's kind of a leading question, but um like
Yeah, and I like, that's like kind of a fun part of the whole regenerative. I mean, it's fun both in like when I'm when I'm not on a contract, so I'm just in my rancher hat, and then I say, "Oh wow, look, this field has, you know, so much more. This field can support so many more animals compared to when I started on it a few years ago because of how it's healed, and this field can support so many more animals than the neighbor's field across the fence line because it's been managed properly." So that's satisfying. And then, yeah, working with clients, I'm about to go back and work for City of Davis for a park there and doing ecological work there for the third year in the row. And it's, yeah, it's been super dramatic the way that land's healed. And then, yeah, similarly, working with winemakers, grape growers, and yeah, having the land come along for them and kind of helping them figure out going organic or going no till is, yeah, all that stuff's been super satisfying.
have you seen I mean, you just mentioned it with the Davis Park, like you see having seen that land heal. Have you seen that in any vineyards, and what does that mean? Like what did it look like? What does it look like? What is it healing from? What does that look like?
Um,
That's a two-part
well,
question.
a lot of times one dramatic marker is, or one good marker is soil organic matter, right?
Okay.
And, I mean, the vineyards, I don't really, I just kind of come in at my time of the year and play my role and then I'm out. So I just kind of more go, I more go from conversations with the vineyard manager. But, yeah, like, Bedrock Vineyards would be a great, example of, those are folks who are, tracking their soil organic matter and seeing really good improvements. So, and grazing isn't the only regenerative thing that they're doing, but so it's not strictly scientific in that sense. But yeah, that's definitely been a case, I'd say, working with uh, Bedrock Wine Co. of seeing, yeah, being part of something, of seeing the land really healing.
Yeah. And I guess, well, I mean, since we're kind of steering in that direction, let's talk about working with vineyards. I mean, I should be honest and say, like, I probably, our conversation started at that, the panel that Napa Green put on that I moderated, where I was
Hmm.
like giving some cautionary words about working with contract grazers, and
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I stand behind that because I heard this from farmers who had bad experiences, But obviously, not all experiences are bad with contract grazers. There's some amazing contract grazers out there. I think you're one of them.
Mm.
Can you talk though about what some of the realities might be for, let's say, let's say a lot of people who might be listening to this are wine growers, wine makers, or are considering and are considering working with a contract grazer, or would like to, or have already decided to. But what kind of like words of advice can you give in terms of both helping them understand the differences between what they want and what you want, if there are conflicts in those. Obviously both want the same thing in terms of the health of the land and stuff like that, but
Uh-huh.
in terms of just managing that process of bringing sheep or whatever onto their land, and that whole thing. Can you sort of give your side of the story for that, and what people should expect, and how to make that process as seamless and helpful and beneficial to everybody as possible?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll just go really back to the rudimentary at first and just say, when we talk about the vineyard grazing, we're talking about most of the time, grazing pre-bud break. So it's basically a, vegetation management tool of bringing in sheep, uh, n- bringing sheep into the vineyards to a lot of times, planted cover crop, sometimes not planted cover crop, but as a vegetation management tool to return that all that above ground vegetation back into the soil, and kind of, as you're getting into the spring and February and March, starting to keep ahead of all that vegetative growth, and again enrich your soil and add the soil
Sheep
fertility,
saliva, right? Like, I mean, like
the
this
saliva.
would be why somebody wouldn't want to mow, why they might want to bring you instead of mowing, because of these added biological benefits, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's just to say the what, it's like that's what the sheep grazing is in terms of like a contract grazer basically just means somebody who's going to bring in everything soup to nuts of, as I say on the website, I just need, from the vineyard, I just need like, some power to plug into, just like a wall socket, and then, a hose spigot, and I bring everything else, all the electric fences, the fence charger, the animals, of course, so the sheep, the guardian dogs, the water infrastructure, a little bit of infrastructure to truck the water around via ATV when needed. So that's what it means really when you're dealing with a contract grazer. Someone's going to bring everything to your vineyard that you need to do the grazing. And in terms of the why, I'd say there's soil for to give kind of a few, list a few headings of it. I'd say there's soil fertility, cost savings, labor savings, frost damage mitigation or risk of frost damage mitigation,
Hmm.
and then sometimes, yeah, also help transitioning organic or transitioning to no-till or certified or regenerative.
Right, right. Is there always a cost savings?
No, definitely not.
So what factors go into whether that's going to be a benefit to somebody cost wise?
Good question. I mean, the biggest one for sure, because almost all the vineyards that I graze are organic, are if you're not going to be spraying an herbicide under the vines, then you're going to have to do, you know, a separate tractor pass, if not, like a hand string trimmer pass to deal with that under vine vegetation.
Right.
So yeah, so for the organic people, along with maybe they're also looking at the soil a little bit differently. They also have different sets of constraints or opportunities or whatever to deal with the undervine vegetation. So yeah, their cost per acre with that is going to be higher, and so yeah, there's a good chance that it'll save them some money there compared to somebody that's just spraying the herbicide under the vines. But other factors would be, if you're organic on a slope, especially if it's a development block, all these things really raise the odds of it being cost saving for you. And then the other things I think are like if you have like a year round in-house work crew, depending what their workflow is like in February and March, maybe um, you know, maybe you need jobs for them anyways. It's great to have, somebody, maybe you're paying them anyways and you need to find something for them to do. So maybe it's good to have them, like run the undervine implement, which might be kind of slow, or perhaps not. But if you're if
Yeah.
you're hiring in a vineyard, like I've kind of based my pricing sometimes off of making sure I'm under the vineyard management company's prices for even mechanical mechanical vegetation management, and the grazing usually easily is, at least in Napa Valley. So there's factors there of like, do you have year-round in-house labor, or do you bring in vineyard management people? Because a lot of times it's nice for me to come, like a lot of times it's nice for me dealing with people who use vineyard management, because the vineyard management already has everything rolled into one, like everything from depreciation to payroll taxes is part of the fee that they're charging you. Whereas if you're talking to somebody who has their own tractor and their own employees, like when they're comparing costs with the grazing, they might not really be thinking about it holistically from a bookkeeping perspective.
Ah, yeah, yeah. Good point. Yep.
But
All
yeah,
the
if your labor, if your labor crew is really stretched thin, or you're needing to bring in outside labor that time of year, in mid-March, then yeah, then the sheep are a big relief labor source.
nice. Yeah. And in terms of what about just scheduling? Like, how hard is that for you to do with people? Like, I mean, I I, I I can imagine it's a logistical challenge at the very least from, December till now, really. It must be, which is we're now at the beginning of May. Um you must be in high demand, and do you split your herd? Do you like, are you the only shepherd? Do you have, do you employ multiple shepherds? Like, how does scheduling work, and how do people, what kind of expectations should people have in terms of scheduling? Like, how much time are they going to spend per acre? That kind of thing.
How much time are the sheep going to spend per acre?
Yeah, I mean, like, how, yeah, like,
Well, yeah, I mean, I heard a few questions. I'll try to get to a
yeah,
couple
there's
of.
multiples. Yeah, yeah. So we'll
Yeah,
start
yeah.
with that last one.
Yeah,
And then
that's another good
back.
one is the sheep, in terms of what to expect if you want to get, hire me or any contract grazer for your vineyard. y- The My general rule is 200 sheep should be doing about an acre a day, even of like, pretty good thick cover crop.
Yeah,
So usually these days, I'm bringing 200 as the minimum. Most of the time 400 or 800 to a site. So we're doing kind of, let's say if it's 400 sheep, then we're gonna do, like a 48 hour section of of say 4 acres, and then we'll do that intensively, then move on.
got it.
So that's kind of scheduling the micro, like across the vineyard. And then in terms of scheduling the contracts, there's definitely, I employ herders and a team of folks to kind of keep it all, it's a team.
Gotcha. Yeah,
And I also rent in additional sheep from other shepherds and other ranchers for the vineyard grazing season, which works out kind of nicely. It's like I always like when industries can kind of collaborate, so it's like if
yeah,
I go out to a bunch of these shepherds and ranchers I know in the Central Valley at the end of January and say, hey, how about I pay you to feed your animals for a few months, and I'll pay the trucking, then usually they're pretty happy about it, because
yeah,
there's nothing,
yeah.
there's nothing really growing. The grass isn't really growing yet for them at the end of January.
Right. Huh.
Yeah, so it's kind of cool how, yeah, like I say, the industries can get along and collaborate. Um, so there's that. Yeah, definitely try to go a little bigger in the vineyard season compared to maybe say the height of summer. When the water stress is higher, the nutrition stress is higher. I try to slow down and focus on my breeding animals. And yeah, and then I'd say the other thing in terms of scheduling is, well, one thing I'd say is, I would expect there to be a little bit of complexity and a little bit of give and take, especially if you have like a decent sized vineyard, like 30 acres or more.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, if we're talking about bringing 400, 500 sheep onto your property, like 90,000 pounds of animal, there's a lot that comes with that. And and there will be a ton of benefit that comes with it. But, there's just always, it's always a learning curve, and there's always kind of a give and take. So, as you say, there's a lot of demand. So I've been able to be a little picky about who I work with sometimes. And, those are always kind of the folks I want to work with, the folks who get that and are willing to embrace that give and take with me. um and
What
then
is
in terms
the?
of,
Go ahead. Go ahead. No,
well,
finish,
just
please.
yeah, to finish off on scheduling, I'd say sometimes there's folks who want specifically to graze early because they want to have all that manure reintegrated into the soil. And then sometimes there's folks that specifically want to graze later, like just before bud break, so they can save two, maybe, two, maybe three tractor passes instead of just one. So, maybe if they're more focused on the cost savings. I know that Steve, because you interviewed Steve Mathiasen,
Yeah, a
right? Because
couple
I know that
times. Yeah.
yeah, he is obviously like a very influential guy and does a lot of consulting. And I know that like he's been very careful in how he looks at the grazing, because he knows, he looked at those radioisotope tagging studies that were down around Lodi where he was, about like chopping the cover crop and seeing where the nitrogen goes. So, he knows how it all works, when he chops the cover crop with the tractor in terms of having it all cycle through. And so I think, like he's been very like careful and thinking about grazing and talking about the grazing, because he wants to be, sometimes if you see like some manure still on top of the soil at the end of the season, or, I think it was just a question of where all that nitrogen's going and if it's getting into the soil. And
Right.
so, yeah, I think that was kind of motivate people, like I say, sometimes to go earlier in the season. Although, thankfully, a lot of that got answered, to my eyes, pretty conclusively with the paper that came out in fall 2023
Oh,
by
can you
Kelsey
tell?
Brewer and the Godin lab at UC Davis.
Okay. And what was that about? What did
Well, it
they
was just a lot of
disagree with?
good. Yeah, I don't have that one. I'll see what I can pull up from memory of it. But basically, it just was a really good long-term side-by-side of grazed and ungrazed vineyard plots.
Uh-huh.
And it showed, higher nitrogen cycling, higher soil available nitrogen, and same of higher soil available carbon and higher uh, carbon cycling in the grazed plots, um, as well as like a huge increase in soil microbial biomass. So again, of course, I'm the sheep guy, I'm the grazing guy, but to my eyes, it very kind of conclusively, like answered that, or would yeah,
The question, yeah,
very
well, I
conclusive
mean,
showed that.
were you saying that in relation to the timing of the grazing as well? Like whether it's late or early, whether that you see the incorporated poop or not incorporated poop? Is that what you were
Yeah,
talking
I
about?
don't think what they did was all early at all. I think a lot of it was just before bud break. So I think it's just,
Yeah.
and that'd be a good one to look at specifically in the methodology of that study. But
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, I think to my recollection of it, it kind of spoke to that, and yeah, put aside those fears, I'd say,
Yeah, that's great.
that you'd be losing any soil benefits from doing the grazing versus doing, mechanical, vegetation management.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think about that too. I mean, when I was working in the vineyard with the sheep and you see all the poop that's just laying on top of the dead, mulch of August or whatever. And then you're like, what's that doing for it? But that's a short-term look. I mean, obviously that's, there's winter's going to come again and everything's going to grow, it's going to cycle eventually and yeah. I
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean, a group of 400 sheep will be putting down, 1,500 pounds of manure per day. And what you might be seeing might be pretty marginal, or very, very marginal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've heard good things that like, the urine might be underrated as well. Like that
Uh-huh. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a
But
lot of
yeah,
good.
like I say, I'm having trouble calling it all to mind, but I think that for anybody who's, yeah, like, like I said about Steve, like I said in talks I've had about Steve, anybody who's weighing the grazing and thinking about it in terms of the soil benefit question, I think yeah, Kelsey's study and all I forget the other authors, but Kelsey's study was a really awesome resource for all that.
So I hear you, dog. So are you aware of any studies or even anecdotes about benefits to the finished products, especially like in vineyards from grazing, from long-term grazing?
Like, what's the effect on the wine?
Yeah.
Um, Mostly, maybe I don't know, but I know that the grazing. I'll kind of connect a couple dots, and it might be getting a little bit tenuous, but maybe not. I think that the grazing, is a super has like a clearly demonstrated really strong benefit on soil microbial biomass and soil
Mhm.
microbiology. And Reed Griggs, who I met when he was still working with Graham McDonald, he had participated in, and I think been a main author on getting published a bunch of studies showing the linkage between soil microbiology and the phenolics in wine.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I really can't, I won't be able to answer any follow-up questions about phenolics in wine, but
No, that's
um,
fine.
but anyways, that's the best kind of linkage I can come up with to, grazing giving you that soil microbiology, and then like I said, Reed's work showing the direct connection between soil microbiology and then those phenolics that influence the character, of the wine in a beneficial way.
What was his name again?
Reed Griggs, Griggs, I think.
Okay, cool. Now, I wanted to go back before we left it, because I feel like it's really important. The what are the I guess the crunch points, or what have you seen be the points of most conflict between you and the people that contract your services? And
Good question. Well, I'd say the biggest crunch point would be probably people who I don't contract with because, yeah, they're
because they wanted to get you and you weren't available for them.
yeah, there is so much demand.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of constantly calling other shepherds and trying to, connect people and all that stuff during the vineyard season. Because there's a lot of people that do really great work, like Corey with Napa Pasture Protein. She does great work. Steve Gregory, Chasing Groats. Yeah, there's a bunch of folks. Two Rock Land Management. Um, anyways, yeah, so that's a gripe. It's just being able to schedule people. What's the other gripe been? Uh, a lot of times stuff can be kind of like a matter of uh perception to some degree. Like if things look really muddy, like if the sheep are in the vineyard while it's raining, then there can be kind
Yeah.
of like like a fear of damage or a fear of compaction.
Right, right.
And but I was grazing for Maya Del Valle there on that at their vineyard estate on the hillside. She actually got out her penetrometer and was taking some readings of areas like hillsides that the sheep had grazed during a big rain event. So you'd think like, okay, if anything's going to be impacted, it's going to be this. And she said she didn't see any compaction.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I think a lot of times, like I say, there can the question of like perception versus, especially when when working in Napa, like a lot of the bigger, more corporate places, we've been, like Opus One, or a bunch of these big places with just a big organizational structure. It can kind of be, it depends how many people on that organizational structure are bought into the idea of the grazing. And so yeah, perception can get to be very important, versus benefits. So there's all of that. I'd say, it just comes into like communication, especially once pruning crews are out. If because I'm, like if you want to have the sheep and the pruning crews kind of move around each other, there's that. Um, uh, sometimes there's little things with the like sheep kind of snapping off, like um
Oh, like a branch or something. They'll yank on something
no, I was gonna
and
say like a little like elbow of the irrigation, like a little fitting
ah, right,
irrigation.
right. Some damage,
And
yeah.
for years, I don't anymore, but for years in the contract I said, hey, if there's any significant damage, just let me know and I'll cover it. And nobody ever took me up on that, you know.
Oh, that's good. That's nice.
Um, yeah, and I think
And so now it's just sort of like you acknowledge that some damage could happen, and that's
yeah, now
part of the
to be
deal.
honest, now I don't take it on, but I still haven't really, yeah, those years that I didn't have anybody have a big enough, yeah, like see it as a big enough thing that they wanted me to cover it.
Right.
Um and now I still don't really, yeah, I haven't heard anybody talk about that as like a big problem with that. I mean, like that definitely happened at Bedrock the first year I grazed there, but it kind of was like a little bit of lemons into lemonade, because then they just called me in for the next vineyard they were laying out, and they said, hey, we really want to lay out we really want to lay out a grazing friendly vineyard. So, let's we want to have you collaborate in the planning of it, and like the height of the drip tube and all these different things. And so that was really, that was like a great sign to me of like, someone to partner with on stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, well, let's talk about a little bit about that. I mean, where I worked was Piscinus Ranch, which was designed with
Oh
that
yeah,
in mind, and
with Kelly.
with yeah, with Kelly, and so we had 5 to 6 foot high everything.
Uh-huh.
I think the drip tube was the lowest thing at like maybe at 4 feet or 4.5 feet. No, it was probably at close to 5 feet too. I can't remember the specifics, but yeah, I mean, so then not you don't even have to worry about bud break or anything, like the sheep can come in year round. And have you, I mean, is that something that you'd like to see more of? Like, are you seeing more of that? What, is that for what are the alternatives for that if people don't want to go that high? Like, what kind of suggestions did you make to bedrock, for example?
Oh well, it was some small things with bedrock, just like because the standard spacing for the drip tube is like 18 inches off the ground.
Uh-huh.
And,
Right.
I graze in vineyards that have that all the time, and it's not really a problem, but it does happen to be kind of the perfectly awkward height for sheep. Like,
Right.
it
Right.
is, like, the perfect height to make them have to really, like, think about whether or not they wanna go over or under it.
So it's either like go down or go all the way up, for
Yeah, yeah,
to make
so
optimize for sheep, basically.
yeah, so for that, and then with irrigation couplings and fitter, and like tube, I'd usually just say, like the more kind of sagging and loose stuff is, the greater chance it might kind of get tugged around a little bit. So just tightening it up is
Right.
is better. But usually most of the time when I say that, people say, oh yeah, we knew we had to do that anyways. We were meaning to do that anyways.
So what did Bedrock end up doing? Did they end up going high or low? Because I imagine both have consequences. Low, you get into the cover crop, and if you're doing undervine management, you might damage it that way. You might damage the irrigation when you're doing, undervine cultivation or weed whacking or whatever you're doing. But if you go high, you're creating maybe more moisture in the canopy, in the fruiting zone than you want for mildew and things like that.
Uh-huh.
What
Yeah, I don't remember. I think they went high. I think, it even is like just up to 21 inches. So like, like
then the sheep are going to go on.
even a little change makes like kind of made it pivotal for different for the sheep.
Right, and you're still out of the zone that it's to causing any problems for the grapes.
Yeah, although I
So
don't remember super, yeah, I shouldn't speak for them because I don't remember super specifically on that.
okay, okay, gotcha. But yeah, this would be like your general recommendation. Still, would be something like that. Like if you were like a no-till vineyard, maybe you could go down, and if you were not a no-till vineyard, or if you knew you were going to do some undervine management, you might want to go up.
Yeah, I mean 21 is good. But like I
Yeah.
say, yeah, I graze vineyards that are that 18 inches all the time, and it's not really a big deal. Especially because like those newer ones seem like they're all 18 inches, but they're set up with like nice tight, you know, strong wires, so it's not really a problem.
So what would you say about? I mean, do you have people not embracing higher trellising systems, like more like the Piscinus model, or what have you heard out in the world in terms of high trellising?
Well, I mean, I'm always just coming in like a customer service role, in the sense of
Right,
like I'm
right,
here
right,
to make your goals work in your vineyard. So I'm not
right.
usually too big of a voice in planning.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean,
If
all
you
the
had a
experience.
vineyard to plant, what would you do?
Well, I did the one that I have planted.
You didn't
I
go
didn't go
high.
high trellis, but I should have. Although I graze it all the time, and it's just table grapes. So, anyways, I'm kind
Gotcha.
of on the wrong side of that one. But yeah, I've always had really good experiences grazing high trellis vines, and like so many of the vines around Lodi and here in Yolo County and across the
Yeah,
Central Valley are high trained vines. Yeah, I think it
right.
works really well. I think the only thing I've heard. The only thing I've heard about a challenge around it, excuse me, has been um, has been that maybe it requires a lot of nutrients to support that bigger vine every year.
Oh, interesting.
Or maybe
I
just maybe with especially with the Geneva double curtain to support all that vegetation every year, as opposed to like a low, VSP setup.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a new one
Um,
on me, but I mean, it makes sense. I mean, GDC was definitely designed for like, I mean, it was designed for Concord in in New York, so it was for
Uh-huh.
like high vigor, and high rainfall areas. So if you're trying to grow stuff in California that way, that makes a lot of sense. It's going to demand a lot more than maybe what the climate is actually trying to give you. And if you're growing vinifera, it's probably not as vigorous as Concord or
Uh,
productive. I mean, depending on the variety, of course, but yeah. That's interesting. That's a new one on me, but it makes sense in that case specifically. But yeah, I'd like to look into that. That's interesting.
yeah, that's just what I had heard, but yeah, like I said, otherwise, it seemed really awesome all the times that I've gotten to do grazing in the high train vines. It just seems like it makes all kinds of sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, anything else about contract grazing that we should talk about, just for for the sake of anybody who's considering it? I mean, I think, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, what did we hear that day at the panel? I mean, what was the gentleman's name from Mariah? Was it Michael?
Michael, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, he was
that's
saying
right,
because he had definitely gone through some trials and tribulations with it. So what was he saying? Cost was one thing for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And yeah,
And
that makes sense.
they're in a special circumstance too, because they're, I mean, to get sheep up to them it's quite a journey, up to the top of the mountain where they're farming. So that could, they're kind of isolated, and up a mountain road. So I don't know if that's why they were getting higher quotes, and the cost might be higher for them for that reason, just to be fair to that everybody
Right, right,
involved with that.
definitely. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I've heard that. I've definitely, this is like, I mean, it's like people when we had chickens when I was raising chickens in our backyard in Los Angeles, and people be like, "Oh wow, like I bet you like so you get free eggs," and I was like, actually, honestly, if we were trying to like save money on eggs, we should just be buying eggs. Like it's no
Uh-huh.
like we are losing money by producing eggs by having backyard chickens, because it's just there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff from that, but there are other reasons to do it. And I mean, maybe there's, like maybe there's a way to make it financially make sense, but we're using all organic feed and that kind of thing, like trying to keep them really healthy in a small area, which takes a lot of inputs, and
Uh-huh.
so I imagine there could be a situation like that where it's like like does it make financial sense? Like are you like are you, if you look at it just from a total cost perspective, does it like, and that was your only motivation for doing it or not doing it, you might be like, no, don't do it. But I don't know. I mean, this is
Yeah,
kind of
like
a
I say,
question for you.
there's a bunch, yeah, like we said about the labor and organic, non-organic, the slope, is it a development block? There's a bunch of factors that
Right.
could
What's
yeah.
the most expensive sort of, like if somebody's a vineyard owner, like what's the most expensive like the option, like if they were, I mean, what kind of vineyard would incur the most cost? Like a small vineyard with a lot of slope and
Yeah, I mean, basically the cost on our side, the contract raiser side, is the trucking.
right. So whether you're like 5 acres or 50, that's going to be incorporated. So the more acres you have, the more it gets absorbed into the per acre cost. Is that a fair
Yeah, like
assessment?
this year, yeah, I was quoting some people, like 1,000 an acre for, like a 3-acre vineyard I'd have to truck into versus,
Right.
when I was looping in neighbors and doing, like 100 acres or more, that's like 225 an acre.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Those
So,
are great numbers for people to just have to think about.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And,
that's great.
terrain, every quote is different because it's like terrain and a bunch of different stuff.
So
Um
how
But, I think that's the main thing for, anybody who's like, not 100 acres or above, is talk to your neighbors and loop neighbors in, because if we can walk the sheep between neighbors, then we can give everybody that lower rate.
and so what do you do with the sheep during, the like especially for vineyards? Do you have other farms that then need them during like the drier season when the things start to die back? Like, are you in orchards where they're not going to hurt anything, or what do you get? What's your year look like in terms of grazing and feeding the sheep? Just keeping them healthy.
Mhm. Yeah, so sorry, excuse me.
No.
Yeah, maybe late January to late March into April a little bit would be their vineyard grazing season.
Hmm.
And then anywhere like mid-March at to about the end of May, maybe a little bit into June even, would be like ecological grazing season. So, which is what I'm doing right now, working here for the Wintun tribal nation. So that's, like I say, a lot of times lowering populations of noxious weeds, rehabilitating the presence of native plants, native grasses, and just kind of
Right.
working for the overall
Fire
health of the land.
management stuff, like
Yeah, well, actually, that's a different thing.
okay,
Yeah,
got it.
and then, a lot of times just kinda reinvigorating places that have, like, a very stagnant carbon cycle, and then, yeah, and some of those contracts also kind of involve goals of, yeah, vegetation management, fire management, and then, like, mid-June all the way through, you know, mid-September maybe, or end of September is, like, fire grazing season, fire safety season, so we'll add in goats and then do, yeah, and then just do, like, fire safety work, vegetation management.
Okay,
So then
nice.
it's really just, October, November, December, early January where we're not doing any contracts and just kind of doing, just kind of being more classic ranchers.
Gotcha. Yeah. And do you have enough land to for your flock at that point, or is it like do you still rotate between your land and other people's lands at that point?
Uh, sorry.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I lease out
Gotcha.
a couple
Right.
hundred acres here in Yolo and a couple hundred acres in Sonoma, and then there's a bunch of properties that kind of just have like a zero cash agreement with also of they're happy to get the grazing and
Gotcha.
I'm doing in
Yeah.
that off season, so we'll do some of that. So yeah, I'd say I mean that's definitely a lot of like I say, when it goes from like a backyard kind of fun thing to a business, it's a business. You're like, all right, I really have to have I'm going to be feeding 1,000 animals this winter, 2,000 animals this winter, so I really have to have it figured out. It's like, you
Right.
just plan for it and make a good plan.
And when you add in goats, are you using the same kind of fencing?
Yeah, yeah, that's just the same setup. Really, it's just you just have to think about the nutritional supplementation a little bit different because goats want to be getting copper supplement and sheep don't handle that, or it's bad for the sheep's health.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. So, final question for you. It was kind of like a heavy question, but I know you teach a slaughtering class. I mean, it's not a heavy question. It's part of being, part of being a meat eater, and part of being raising animals. But you teach a slaughter and butchering class and everything like that. And I'm just like, I'd love to hear your, take on humane slaughter and that cycle of life aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing I usually say about it is if you are a meat eater and the idea, of doing the slaughter class is, you know, makes you uncomfortable, then that's an interesting feeling to think about.
Yeah.
And not that you should necessarily, like, I don't think everybody has to, but I think yeah, a lot of times it's a really cool experience for people getting to connect those dots.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
and
it
just see, it's like there's a book called about ranching called All Flesh is Grass, and I think, especially when I'm talking to people and getting to kind of connect those dots and they get to see that process, of how to handle an animal, confidently yet humanely and empathetically, and then, to do the kill and to all the steps involved and how to handle it cleanly and everything and take off the skin, open it up, take out the organs. I really like doing the classes because it's always you can just see in people's eyes, their minds are kind of blown, and it's like a very powerful thing for them.
yeah, that is really interesting. So I imagine you don't process all of your own flock though when it comes to slaughter,
Right, right. Yeah, we've kind of scaled out of that. Yeah, a couple years ago.
right? Well, cool. What if somebody is doing home slaughter? What do you recommend as the most humane method
To to
to actually kill a sheep?
um I would just say get the knife sharp, sharpen the knife before you do it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I would just say, just think it through and have a good setup, and just so that you can be really calm and confident and focused and that it's not going to be chaotic at all.
right. That you don't want to create stress. And
Yeah, yeah. It was interesting too, like y- yeah, all the contract work has kind of subsumed the classes a little bit, but last time I did kind of like a solid summer of offering those classes, it was like 90% women that signed up.
okay.
And just seem yeah, and we're just like very enthusiastic about, gaining that skill and yeah, about kind of like taking some control back over, that food source.
why do you is that I mean, why do you think that is? Just because more guys have been exposed to this and that's
Think
changing, or this those
I don't think
opportunities
so.
are
I mean,
changing?
of like when I think about, friends of mine from, Middlebury, like from the liberal arts college, like the big majority of them, haven't gone hunting or haven't slaughtered their own meat or anything. So
Yeah.
I don't think that's it. I don't, yeah, it's a good question as to why.
Hmm. That's
Yeah, I don't
interesting.
think it's because the men know. I think, yeah, I don't know. The women just seem motivated.
Huh. Right on.
And yeah, it's a good question. But yeah, I think it's a very powerful form of, you know, yeah, just like I say, connecting those dots. And it's, I mean, we do live in the age, of course, of, meat in the stores, but it's also like a very powerful form of food sovereignty, because once you know how to convert the grasslands that you live in to the food source that's nurturing you in terms of nutrients, then that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course that like plays into the that plays into that's like pops up 1,000 times in world history, from the Navajo people to the people in Gaza.
What do you
It's like
mean?
to to like break people's back, like as a culture you have to take away
Mm,
their food sovereignty, and so you have to take away their ability to have grazing animals in their grasslands. And so that in just the same way that's happened to the Navajo people, and that happened to people in Gaza, and other times happened to Jewish people during the diaspora. But you know
right.
it's just to say it's it can seem irrelevant in America today, the topic of food sovereignty, but it's relevant right now in the world in different places. And when you think about how how toxic, I don't know, this is just the hippie side coming out, but when you think about how toxic so much of the food system is on various levels, I think it is still really relevant of just having the
Yeah.
ability to feed yourself and feed people you care about food that is clean and nutritious.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's great. Well, that's. Do you have anything else you want to say about that? I think that's powerful. It's a good place to stop if you want to.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Well, thanks for this. I mean, is there anything else like we should have covered?
No, I mean, I feel like, I feel like we, opened up like a few different, kind of like, uh, we opened up a few different jars, and any of them we could have gone into for a couple hours, but that's just the way it goes, I think.
Yeah, I agree. But hopefully, yeah, we'll inspire some people to dig deeper if one of those jars is of interest. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate
No, I
that.
think
Thanks
that's
so much.
maybe the only other thing I'd say is just, if people are listening in Northern California in the North Bay and, want to get in touch with me, I'm always happy to kind of.
Great. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Where should
gotcha.
people find you, or
Yeah, just
what's
via the Instagram or via the website. I'm always happy to kind of like have
that's
people come out and see the flock and see what we're doing and give people a tour. And yeah, it's always great for people to get involved.
perennialgrazing.org or .com? Both
Yeah,
work, I think.
perennialgrazing.org, and then on the Instagram, yeah, and
Perennial Grazing.
perennialgrazing@gmail.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks, Christian. I really appreciate it. Great
Yeah,
talking to you.
yeah, it's been cool. I've had my head in the grass, all, just in the sense of like in the day to day so much. It's cool to pull back into the philosophy of it all.
Nice. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes.